Book 1, Chapter 1, Part 1 of Lord of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Goffney. Lord of the World by Robert Hugh Benson. Book 1, Chapter 1, Part 1. Oliver Brand, the new member for Croydon 4, sat in his study looking out of the window over the top of his typewriter. His house stood facing northwards at the extreme end of a spur of the Surrey Hills, now cut and tunneled out of all recognition. Only to a communist the view was an inspiring one. Immediately below the wide windows the embanked ground fell away rapidly for perhaps 100 feet, ending in a high wall, and beyond that the world and works of men were triumphant as far as the eye could see. Two vast tracks like streaked race courses, each not less than a quarter of a mile in width, and sunk 20 feet below the surface of the ground, swept up to a meeting a mile ahead at the huge junction. Of those, that on his left was the first trunk road to Brighton, inscribed in capital letters in the railroad guide. That to the right, the second trunk, to the Tunbridge and Hastings district. Each was divided lengthways by a cement wall, on one side of which, on steel rails, ran the electric trams, and on the other lay the motor track itself, again divided into three, on which ran, first, the government coaches at a speed of 150 miles an hour, second, the private motors at not more than 60, third, the cheap government line at 30, with stations every 5 miles. This was further bordered by a road confined to pedestrians, cyclists, and ordinary cars, on which no vehicle was allowed to move at more than 12 miles an hour. Beyond these great tracks lay an immense plain of house roofs, with short towers here and there marking public buildings, from the Caterham district to the left to the Croydon in front, all clear and bright in smokeless air, and far away to the west and north showed the low suburban hills against the April sky. There was surprisingly little sound, considering the pressure of the population, and with the exception of the buzz of the steel rails as a train fled north or south, and the occasional sweet chord of the great motors as they neared or left the junction, there was little to be heard in this study except a smooth, soothing murmur that filled the air like the murmur of bees in a garden. Oliver loved every hint of human life, all busy sights and sounds, and was listening now, smiling faintly to himself as he stared out into the clear air. Then he set his lips, laid his fingers on the keys once more, and went on speech constructing. He was very fortunate in the situation of his house. It stood in an angle of one of those huge spider webs with which the country was covered, and for his purposes was all that he could expect. It was close enough to London to be extremely cheap, for all wealthy persons had retired at least 100 miles from the throbbing heart of England, and yet it was as quiet as he could wish. He was within 10 minutes of Westminster on the one side, and 20 minutes of the sea on the other, and his constituency lay before him like a raised map. Further, since the great London termini were but 10 minutes away, there were at his disposal the first trunk lines to every big town in England. For a politician of no great means, who was asked to speak at Edinburgh on one evening and in Marseille on the next, he was as well placed as any man in Europe. He was a pleasant-looking man, not much over 30 years old, black wire-haired, clean-shaven, thin, virile, magnetic, blue-eyed and white-skinned, and he appeared this day extremely content with himself and the world. His lips moved slightly as he worked, his eyes enlarged and diminished with excitement, and more than once he paused and stared out again, smiling and flushed. Then a door opened. A middle-aged man came nervously in with a bundle of papers, laid them down on the table without a word, and turned to go out. Oliver lifted his hand for attention, snapped a lever, and spoke. "Well, Mr. Phillips?" he said. "There's news from the east, sir," said the secretary. Oliver shot a glance sideways and laid his hand on the bundle. "Any complete message?" he asked. "No, sir, it's interrupted again. Mr. Felsenburgh's name is mentioned." Oliver did not seem to hear. He lifted the flimsy printed sheets with a sudden movement and began turning them. "The fourth from the top, Mr. Brand," said the secretary. Oliver jerked his head impatiently, and the other went out as if at a signal. The fourth sheet from the top, printed in red on green, seemed to absorb Oliver's attention altogether, for he read it through 2 or 3 times, leaning back motionless in his chair. Then he sighed and stared again through the window. Then once more the door opened, and a tall girl came in. "Well, my dear," she observed. Oliver shook his head with compressed lips. "Nothing definite," he said, "even less than usual. Listen." He took up the green sheet and began to read aloud as the girl sat down in a window seat on his left. She was a very charming-looking creature, tall and slender, with serious, ardent gray eyes, firm red lips, and a beautiful carriage of head and shoulders. She had walked slowly across the room as Oliver took up the paper, and now sat back in her brown dress in a very graceful and stately attitude. She seemed to listen with a deliberate kind of patience, but her eyes flickered with interest. "Irkutsk, April 14, yesterday. As usual, but rumored defection from Sufi party. Troops continue gathering. Felsenburgh addressed Buddhist crowd. Attempt on Lama last Friday. Work of anarchists. Felsenburgh leaving for Moscow as arranged. He—" "There, that is absolutely all," ended Oliver dispiritedly. "It's interrupted as usual." The girl began to swing a foot. "I don't understand in the least," she said. "Who is Felsenburgh, after all?" "My dear child, that is what all the world is asking. Nothing is known except that he was included in the American deputation at the last moment. The Herald published his life last week, but it has since been contradicted. It is certain that he is quite a young man, and that he has been quite obscure until now." "Well, he is not obscure now," observed the girl. "I know. It seems as if he were running the whole thing. One never hears a word of the others. It's lucky he's on the right side." "And what do you think?" Oliver turned vacant eyes again out of the window. "I think it's touch and go," he said. "The only remarkable thing is that here hardly anybody seems to realize it. It's too big for the imagination, I suppose. There's no doubt that the East has been preparing for a descent on Europe for these last 5 years. They've only been checked by America, and this is one last attempt to stop them. But why Felsenburgh should come to the front," he broke off. "He must be a good linguist at any rate. This is at least the 5th crowd he has addressed. Perhaps he is just the American interpreter. Christ, I wonder who he is." "Has he any other name?" "Julian, I believe. One message said so." "How did this come through?" Oliver shook his head. "Private enterprise," he said. "The European agencies have stopped work. Every telegraph station is guarded night and day. There are lines of volors strung out on every frontier. The Empire means to settle this business without us." "And if it goes wrong?" "My dear Mabel, if hell breaks loose—" He threw out his hands deprecatingly. "And what is the government doing?" "Working night and day. So is the rest of Europe. It'll be Armageddon with a vengeance if it comes to war." "What chance do you see?" "I see 2 chances," said Oliver slowly. "One, that they may be afraid of America and may hold their hands from sheer fear. The other, that they may be induced to hold their hands from charity. If only they can be made to understand that cooperation is the one hope of the world. But those damned religions of theirs—" The girl sighed and looked out again onto the wide plain of house roofs below the window. The situation was indeed as serious as it could be. That huge empire, consisting of a federalism of states under the sun of heaven, made possible by the merging of the Japanese and Chinese dynasties and the fall of Russia, had been consolidating its forces and learning its own power during the last 35 years, ever since, in fact, it had laid its lean yellow hands upon Australia and India. While the rest of the world had learned the folly of war, ever since the fall of the Russian Republic under the combined attack of the yellow races, the last had grasped its possibilities. It seemed now as if the civilization of the last century was to be swept back once more into chaos. It was not that the mob of the East cared very greatly. It was their rulers who had begun to stretch themselves after an almost eternal lethargy, and it was hard to imagine how they could be checked at this point. There was a touch of grimness, too, in the rumor that religious fanaticism was behind the movement, and that the patient East proposed at last to proselytize by the modern equivalents of fire and sword those who had laid aside, for the most part, all religious beliefs except that in humanity. To Oliver it was simply maddening. As he looked from his window and saw the vast limit of London laid peaceably before him, as his imagination ran out over Europe and saw everywhere that steady triumph of common sense and fact over the wild fairy stories of Christianity, it seemed intolerable that there should be even a possibility that all this should be swept back again into the barbarous turmoil of sects and dogmas, for no less than this would be the result if the East laid hands on Europe. Even Catholicism would revive, he told himself, that strange faith that had blazed so often as persecution had been dashed to quench it. And of all forms of faith, to Oliver's mind, Catholicism was the most grotesque and enslaving. And the prospect of all this honestly troubled him, far more than the thought of the physical catastrophe and bloodshed that would follow on Europe with the advent of the East. There was but one hope on the religious side, as he had told Mabel a dozen times, and that was that the quietistic pantheism, which for the last century had made such giant strides in East and West alike, among Mohammedans, Buddhists, Hindus, Confucianists, and the rest, should avail to check the supernatural frenzy that inspired their exoteric brethren. Pantheism, he understood, was what he held himself. For him, God was the developing sum of created life, and impersonal unity was the essence of his being. Competition, then, was the great heresy that set men one against another and delayed all progress. For, to his mind, progress lay in the merging of the individual in the family, of the family in the commonwealth, of the commonwealth in the continent, and of the continent in the world. Finally, the world itself at any moment was no more than the mood of impersonal life. It was, in fact, the Catholic idea, with the supernatural left out, a union of earthly fortunes, an abandonment of individualism on the one side, and of supernaturalism on the other. It was treason to appeal from God immanent to God transcendent. There was no God transcendent. God, so far as he could be known, was man. Yet these two, husband and wife after a fashion, for they had entered into that terminable contract now recognized explicitly by the state, these two were very far from sharing in the usual heavy dullness of mere materialists. The world for them beat with one ardent life blossoming in flower and beast and man, a torrent of beautiful vigor flowing from a deep source and irrigating all that moved or felt. Its romance was the more appreciable because it was comprehensible to the minds that sprang from it. There were mysteries in it, but mysteries that enticed rather than baffled, for they unfolded new glories with every discovery that man could make. Even inanimate objects, the fossil, the electric current, the far-off stars, these were dust thrown off by the spirit of the world, fragrant with his presence and eloquent of his nature. For example, the announcement made by Klein, the astronomer, 20 years before, that the inhabitation of certain planets had become a certified fact, how vastly this had altered men's view of themselves. But the one condition of progress and the building of Jerusalem, on the planet that happened to be men's dwelling place, was peace, not the sword which Christ brought, or that which Mohammed wielded, but peace that arose from, not past, understanding. The peace that sprang from a knowledge that man was all, and was able to develop himself only by sympathy with his fellows. To Oliver and his wife, then, the last century seemed like a revelation. Little by little the old superstitions had died, and the new light broadened. The spirit of the world had roused himself. The sun had dawned in the west, and now with horror and loathing they had seen the clouds gather once more in the quarter whence all superstition had had its birth. Mabel got up presently and came across to her husband. "My dear," she said, "you must not be downhearted. It all may pass as it passed before. It is a great thing that they are listening to America at all, and this Mr. Felsenburgh seems to be on the right side." Oliver took her hand and kissed it. End of Book 1, Chapter 1, Part 1. Recording by John Goffney of audiovectors.com.